Were you? Melinda's voice cut through the tension, cold and sharp. Or were you just looking for someone to dominate, letting your prejudice take over your duty? Her eyes locked onto his, unyielding. Because what I witnessed here wasn't a commitment to serve. It was a display of power, misused power. In that moment, silence fell as authority met arrogance head-on. Welcome to our channel, where stories come to life with heart and purpose. Here, we explore tales of resilience, justice, and compassion. If you want to see more inspiring stories like this, please hit that subscribe button. Like, share, and let us hear your thoughts. Your support will fuel our creativity and help us craft more heartwarming, powerful tales that touch lives and uplift spirits. Melinda Smith gripped the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar streets as she drove slowly through the neighborhood she was about to serve. This was her first day as the newly appointed chief of the precinct, and though her title held power, she had no intention of letting it go to her head. Melinda had always been driven by purpose, not ego. Her mission was to lead with empathy, fairness, and integrity, something she knew this community desperately needed. She had chosen not to wear her uniform that morning. Instead, she opted for professional but understated civilian clothes, hoping to blend in and get a genuine feel of the neighborhood. Melinda wanted to see this community as it was, without the imposing barrier of her uniform. She wanted to connect, to feel the energy, and to understand the everyday lives of the people who lived here. As she drove, she couldn't help but notice the faded murals, the crowded corner shops, and the weary faces of residents walking along the sidewalks. There was a tension in the air, something almost tangible. Melinda knew that the relationship between the community and the police had been strained for years. She had read the reports, but sitting behind a desk or scanning statistics could never truly capture the depth of mistrust that had developed here. This place had seen too many injustices, too many moments when the police were more feared than trusted. She could feel the weight of her responsibility with every block she passed. As a black woman, she understood the pain of being judged, of being seen as less than, simply because of who she was. She had faced countless battles in her life, and each one had only made her stronger. Now she was here to lead this precinct not just with authority, but with compassion and respect. She wanted to create a space where her officers would see themselves as protectors, not enforcers. And more importantly, she wanted the community to see the precinct as a place of safety, not suspicion. But as she neared the precinct building, something shifted in the atmosphere. Out of the corner of her eye, Melinda noticed a squad car slowing down, its lights flashing briefly as it pulled up behind her. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw 3 officers watching her closely. A hint of curiosity flickered through her mind, but she kept calm. Maybe they were simply patrolling and found her out-of-place vehicle unusual in the area. The squad car remained behind her as she took a right turn, heading directly toward the precinct parking lot. It didn't take long before the officers signaled for her to pull over, the sudden, sharp glare of the red and blue lights now unmistakable. With a sigh, Melinda pulled her car to the curb, her thoughts racing. The officers didn't know who she was. Why would they? She hadn't formally introduced herself to the precinct yet, and she'd chosen not to bring any of the official escorts offered to her. She had simply wanted to arrive quietly, without fanfare. But now, she was drawing attention of a very different sort. She rolled down her window as the officers approached, her heart pounding but her face calm. She saw the name badges on their uniforms: John McLucas, Donald Wilson, and Andrew Shaw. McLucas, the oldest of the 3, gave her a hard, evaluating stare. He was the first to speak, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Good morning, officers," she began evenly, trying to put them at ease. "Is there a problem?" McLucas didn't return her greeting. Instead, he glanced back at his colleagues, Donald Wilson and Andrew Shaw, before turning his cold gaze back to her. "Ma'am, I'd like to know what you're doing driving around this part of town," he said bluntly, his voice edged with suspicion. "It's not often we see outsiders in this neighborhood." Melinda felt the sting of his tone, the thinly veiled implication in his words. Outsiders. That's what he saw her as. An intruder, someone who didn't belong. But she kept her tone measured, refusing to let his hostility provoke her. "I'm on my way to a meeting," she replied. "I have business here." McLucas narrowed his eyes, as if testing her words, looking for any crack in her calm exterior. "A meeting?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Mind telling us exactly what kind of business you have here, dressed like that?" At his words, Melinda felt a surge of frustration bubbling up, but she kept her voice steady. "It's official business. I'd prefer to keep it private if that's all right." Donald Wilson and Andrew Shaw watched silently from behind McLucas, their expressions serious but less aggressive. They hadn't said a word, yet their intense stares made her feel as though she was under a magnifying glass, every small movement scrutinized and analyzed. It was clear they were following McLucas's lead, not questioning his line of attack. McLucas leaned in closer, his voice low and filled with a chilling coldness. "Listen, lady, this is a high-crime area. People don't just come here for business. So, I'll ask you one more time. What exactly are you doing here?" There was an unmistakable undertone in his voice, a message that said he had already made up his mind about her. In his eyes, she was suspicious, untrustworthy. Melinda felt a pang of disappointment. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, something uglier. Still, she kept her response simple, refusing to let his hostility break her. "I don't think I'm required to answer that in more detail, officer." Her calmness seemed to infuriate McLucas. He scoffed, glancing at his colleagues for support. "So that's how it is, huh?" he sneered. "Driving around like you own the place and refusing to answer questions. You think we're just going to let you off like that?" Melinda's heart pounded, but she remained silent, refusing to engage in his baiting. Finally, he straightened, folding his arms and giving her a dark smile. "Well, maybe we can help you out," he said, voice laced with mock generosity. "Since you're so eager to get on with your business, there's an easy way to settle this. How about a little cash fine, right here and now? That way, you can be on your way, and we can get back to real work." A flicker of shock crossed her face before she quickly masked it. He was attempting to extort her. He didn't see her as a person, let alone someone who might hold authority. He simply saw a potential victim, someone to intimidate for a quick payoff. Donald and Andrew looked slightly uncomfortable, exchanging quick glances, but neither of them spoke up. They weren't exactly supporting McLucas's approach, but they weren't challenging him either. Their silence was complicit, and it stung Melinda to see that none of them realized, or cared, that she was their new chief. But Melinda wasn't about to let her emotions slip. She took a deep breath, calming herself before meeting McLucas's gaze with a steely determination. "So, you're saying I need to pay to continue my drive?" she asked, her voice low but firm. McLucas smirked. "That's right. A little cooperation goes a long way." There was a tense pause, filled only by the distant sounds of city life. Melinda felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, and she knew it was time to assert herself, to let her presence be known, not as a target, but as someone in control. With a calm that surprised even her, Melinda finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Are you finished?" she asked, her words soft, but laced with an authority that caught all three officers off guard. They blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in her tone. McLucas scoffed, attempting to shrug off her confidence, but he couldn't quite mask his unease. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Melinda took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The hostility, the distrust, the implied threats, all of it had coiled like a tight spring inside her. But she kept her composure. She knew this was the time to let these officers see her true position, her real authority. Without a word, she reached down, calm and deliberate, into her bag on the passenger seat. The officers watched closely, their expressions a mix of suspicion and confusion, likely expecting her to pull out her wallet or some cash to settle things. Instead, Melinda pulled out a black leather badge holder and, in one fluid motion, opened it in front of them. The gleaming badge of her office, stamped with the words Chief of Police, glinted in the sunlight. She held it steady, allowing each of them to take in what it meant. For a long, tense moment, the officers just stared. John McLucas's face shifted from smug satisfaction to pure disbelief, his mouth dropping open slightly. He seemed frozen, his eyes wide and blinking, as if his brain couldn't process the information. Donald Wilson and Andrew Shaw, standing just behind him, looked equally stunned, their faces going pale as the full weight of their actions settled on them. The three of them were looking at their new chief, the very person they had insulted, humiliated, and tried to extort. There was a long, painful silence before McLucas stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chief, I had no idea. I mean, if I'd known." Melinda didn't give him a chance to finish. Her calm, steady gaze made it clear she was not in the mood for excuses. "If you'd known." "What, Officer McLucas?" she asked, her voice even but edged with a controlled anger that made him flinch. "You'd have acted differently, treated me with the respect I deserve. Or maybe just the respect any citizen deserves." McLucas opened his mouth again, as if to protest, but the words seemed to die in his throat. He looked down, swallowing hard, and mumbled something incoherent about protocol and standard procedure. His arrogance from moments before had vanished completely. Now all that remained was a man stripped of his power, his authority reduced to shame and regret. Donald Wilson and Andrew Shaw stood behind him, visibly shaken. Their faces mirrored guilt and regret, and they shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances at each other, as if hoping one of them would somehow make this nightmare go away. But there was no escaping the consequences of their actions now. Melinda didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her quiet authority was enough. She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You swore an oath to protect and serve," she said, her words carrying a heavy weight. "An oath to treat every member of the public with respect, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like. And yet, the first time you encounter someone you don't recognize, someone who doesn't look the way you think they should, you choose intimidation, disrespect, extortion." The officers' heads hung low, each of them now too ashamed to meet her eyes. The reality of what they'd done washed over them, layer by layer, exposing the ugliness of their actions. They had not only disrespected a stranger, they had disrespected the very person who held their careers in her hands. More importantly, they had betrayed the values they had sworn to uphold. McLucas tried once more to salvage the situation. "Chief, I apologize. It was a misunderstanding. We were just trying to do our job." "Were you?" Melinda interrupted, her voice as cold and sharp as a blade. "Or were you trying to enforce your own prejudices, looking for someone to exercise your authority over? Because what I saw here was not a commitment to duty. It was a display of power. Misused power." Her words hit like a hammer, each one driving deeper into the officer's growing sense of shame. Donald and Andrew exchanged a glance, their faces a mixture of regret and embarrassment. McLucas, for the first time, seemed completely deflated, his pride and arrogance shattered in the face of her unwavering gaze. Melinda continued, her tone unwavering. "This is not the kind of leadership I want in my precinct. If you can't treat a citizen with respect, then how can I expect you to treat your fellow officers or this community? You are supposed to be role models, officers of integrity. What you've shown me today is the opposite of everything this uniform should stand for." By the time she finished speaking, all three officers were standing in silence, humbled and remorseful. They were no longer the same men who had approached her car with smug confidence. Now they stood like scolded children, each acutely aware of the depth of their mistake. The silence stretched on, thick with the weight of everything left unsaid. And in that silence, the officers finally saw the truth. They had not only failed her, but they had failed the very people they were sworn to serve. Later that afternoon, Melinda stood at the front of the precinct's briefing room, her gaze calm yet powerful as she looked over the rows of officers seated before her. The room was buzzing with curiosity. News of something big had already spread among the team. Melinda could see McLucas, Wilson, and Shaw seated near the back, their faces taut with anticipation and likely lingering embarrassment. Though the trio had regained some composure since their roadside encounter, she could tell that the shame from earlier still weighed heavily on them. Melinda took a breath, her voice steady and warm as she began her address. Thank you all for gathering here today. As many of you know, I'm Melinda Smith, your new precinct chief, and I want to begin by saying that I am incredibly honored to work alongside each of you. Her voice carried sincerity, her words intentional, and immediately, the room fell into a respectful silence. This morning, I had an experience that reminded me why I accepted this position, she continued. You see, I was given a first-hand look at the challenges this community faces when it comes to interacting with law enforcement. Many residents here feel wary or fearful of us, unsure whether we'll see them as people or simply as problems to control. I experienced this myself, something that strengthened my belief that we have a unique opportunity to make a change. She paused, letting her words sink in, scanning the room to gauge each officer's reaction. Without singling out the 3 officers involved, she added, "We, as police officers, hold a lot of power. But with that power comes responsibility. The people in this community rely on us to protect and serve them, to be fair, and to treat each person with respect. When we fail to do that, we betray not only them, but also ourselves and everything this badge stands for." McLucas, Wilson, and Shaw shifted uncomfortably in their seats, her words stinging in a way that was both corrective and eye-opening. Melinda saw the subtle reactions across their faces, lowered gazes, quiet shame, and maybe even the beginnings of humility. Starting today, she continued, I want each of us to remember that respect and fairness are not just words. They're actions. And to help us understand the community better, I have an assignment for all of you. Her eyes flicked briefly toward McLucas, Wilson, and Shaw, and though she didn't name them, she saw their shoulders straighten, the attention making them tense. I'll be assigning rotating shifts where 2 to 3 officers will participate in community outreach activities each week. This will mean working directly with residents on neighborhood improvement projects, spending time in local schools, and meeting with community leaders. It's an opportunity to hear firsthand from the people we serve, to learn from them, to let them see us as human, and for us to understand the challenges they face daily. She allowed herself a small smile as she added, Officers McLucas, Wilson, and Shaw, you'll be the first to lead this effort. The 3 officers looked up, their faces a mix of relief and surprise. This was no harsh punishment, no demotion, and no public shaming. Instead, it was a chance for growth, a corrective measure that invited them to reconnect with the very people they had sworn to serve. It was as if she had handed them a mirror and asked them to look at themselves through the eyes of the community. Melinda wrapped up her address by sharing her vision for the precinct, her voice filled with hope. I know that together we can create a precinct that this community trusts, a precinct where each officer feels proud not only of the badge, but of the integrity and respect that come with it. Every day, each of you will have the chance to make this community stronger, safer, and more connected. As she concluded, the room was silent, many officers visibly moved. For McLucas, Wilson, and Shaw, the words carried an extra weight. Melinda's calm, guiding leadership had stirred something within them, a desire to redeem themselves and to rebuild the trust they had lost. Over the weeks that followed, Melinda's vision began to unfold in tangible ways. The community outreach shifts became more than just an assignment. They transformed into opportunities for real connections. McLucas found himself conversing with local shop owners, sharing stories, and gaining an appreciation for their hard work. Wilson spent time mentoring teens at the local community center, surprising himself with how much he enjoyed it. Shaw, initially quiet and hesitant, soon became a favorite among neighborhood children, often joining them in street games during his patrol. The community, too, began to notice the shift. Slowly but surely, residents started to greet the officers with smiles instead of wary glances. Trust, something that had felt distant for so long, was beginning to blossom. One afternoon, Melinda watched from her office window as her officers interacted with a group of residents outside. They laughed, shook hands, and shared stories, small moments that spoke to a larger change. She felt a swell of pride, knowing that her approach had helped to create this shift, one rooted in respect, transparency, and understanding. In that moment, she knew that the precinct was transforming, not just for her team, but for the entire community. And as she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, she felt certain of one thing. Change had truly begun, and it was here to stay. Thank you so much for watching. Don't leave without subscribing. Your support means the world to us. Together, we'll keep sharing these moving stories with communities everywhere.